Hello, well, good morning or evening, depends on where you are in the world, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Alex Tate from Reform Political Advertising, and it's a privilege to open what I believe is one of the most important conversations that we can have right now, how we can restore truth, integrity, and trust in our politics. We're just days away from major elections, and as we've seen over the last couple of years in the UK, we've been tracking a flood of political advertising, social media, campaigning, and increasingly sophisticated misinformation and disinformation. And today the stakes are really higher than ever before, I'd suggest. It's not just about a few misleading leaflets or out of context quotes. It's actually about an information environment that's transformed by tech platforms, social media algorithms, and now by the explosive rise of AI. And fake news sites and AI generated disinformation, those aren't future threats. That's something that's happening right now. And we've been seeing examples of that over the last couple of weeks in the UK. From a mayoral candidate who set up a Facebook page purporting to be a news service, attacking their main opponent, through to anonymous, unsubstantiated rumours about the Prime Minister with millions of views being shared by AI generated content to maximise engagement. And somewhat unbelievably, I think, within that context, election advertising content remains almost entirely unregulated in the UK and much of Australia. And ads for washing powder has got 4 sets of UK regulations it's got to comply with, but an ad for your vote has got absolutely zero requirement to be accurate. And so I suppose we're all here today really because we believe democracy deserves better and voters deserve better. And to tell you a little bit about Reform Political Advertising, we're a politically impartial, not-for-profit organisation fighting for a simple but powerful change that factual claims in election ads should be regulated under a code agreed by political parties, similar to the setup that exists for commercial advertising. And research that we've done over the last couple of years with Opinion and YouGov shows that the public overwhelmingly support that. Last year, 76% of the UK public would support it being a legal requirement that factual claims in ads should be accurate, and only 4% would oppose such a measure. And the House of Lords Digital Technology, Democracy and Technology Committee in 2020, which was chaired by Lord Putman at the time, who now chairs our campaign, called for election advertising regulation as one of its key recommendations, which was a unanimous recommendation actually from the cross-party group. And we're not just calling for change, we're trying to sort of show, I suppose, how it can be done. At the last UK general election, we ran an independent electoral ad review panel to demonstrate how fact-checking political ads could work in practice. And we've also created a voluntary ad code that asks political advertisers to commit to not mislead voters. And we tested that in the mayoral elections, the London mayoral elections last year. And we're very pleased that we had 6 candidates sign up. We had the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, the Liberal Democrat candidate, the Green candidate sign up to that. And actually, we've had good uptake of that in the mayoral elections this year as well. But the reason for this event, it's not just a UK issue. Around the world, democratic societies are facing the same threats and leading voices are stepping up. So you're going to hear shortly from Zali Steggall in Australia, who very impressively, I think, has introduced 2 bills to prohibit misleading and deceptive political advertising, and has also launched an ethical advertising code. And actually, in that part of the world, there are existing precedents too. There are 2 states in Australia where electoral advertising regulations in place, in South Australia and ACT. And actually, New Zealand's had it up and running for several decades with all the parties bought into the process. So it can be done, and in our view, it must be done, because if we don't take steps to tackle disinformation and we allow technology, AI and unchecked political advertising to fill the vacuum, trust's going to erode even further. Cynicism's going to win, and democracy itself ultimately is going to be the victim of that. So today's event is somewhat of a rallying call, I suppose, in some ways, to politicians, campaigners and citizens alike, to look at how we can rebuild trust. We believe that we can rebuild it, we can clean up politics, and we can demand better. And change is possible when enough people demand it, and enough people do, then sometimes it becomes inevitable. So really, we're incredibly lucky to be joined today by a brilliant panel of politicians and an ex-politician, who several of which actually are leading by example on this topic. Thank you so much for taking part in the event today. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Jennifer to introduce the speakers and to lead the discussion. Jennifer Nadal is the CEO of Compassion in Politics. She's also a qualified barrister, award-winning television journalist, author, and director of Compassionate Politics at Stanford University's Centre for Compassion and Altruism Education and Research.
Thanks so much, Alex, and welcome to everybody who's joining us. If you would like to put in the chat where you are joining us from, that would be wonderful. Compassion in Politics works on a cross-party basis to promote ethics and compassion in politics. We're proud to support Reform Political Advertising's campaign to regulate advertising, and we also promote a complementary bill which would create an offence for politicians and candidates who deliberately misrepresent the facts. So we want to go beyond advertising. That bill was introduced as a private member's bill in 2022 to the UK Parliament, and since then has been taken up by Adam Price, whom you're going to hear from shortly. So without truth, democracy falters. And as Alex said, we're here to discuss what we can do about it. And I'll now introduce you to our illustrious panel. Zali Steggall is an Australian independent MP who defeated the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Of course, at the moment, she's technically a candidate as she's in the middle of an election process. Before coming to Parliament, she was, amongst other things, a solicitor barrister and Winter Olympian. Since being elected, she's introduced 2 bills to prohibit misleading and deceptive political advertising. Next, we have Adam Price, who's a member of the Welsh Parliament and former leader of his party, Plaid Cymru. He was previously a member of the Westminster Parliament and in 2004 sought the impeachment of the then Prime Minister Tony Blair for lying over the Iraq War. He's been the driving force behind the Welsh Labour government's commitment to criminalise deliberate political deception, as well as a supporter of the regulation of political ads. Next, we have Dr. Roz Savage, who was elected as a Liberal Democrat member of the UK Parliament last summer. And in Parliament, she has championed the climate and nature bill. Outside of Parliament, she holds 4 Guinness World Records for ocean rowing, including the first woman to row solo across the 3 oceans. And last but by no means least, we have former Labour MP and Minister Ian Lucas, who's kindly stepped in at the last moment as Debbie Abrahams, the Labour MP, was unfortunately unable to join us due to a select committee engagement. Ian was a member of the Select Committee on Digital Culture and Medias and a key player in the world-leading parliamentary investigation which revealed, amongst other things, the Cambridge Analytica scandal. He's the author of Digital Gangsters, which was published in 2021, and before Parliament worked as a solicitor. So we have a lot of lawyers and recovering lawyers on this panel. Zali, if I can start with you, there is overwhelming support amongst the public for the legislation you propose to regulate political advertising. Why is it so difficult to get the federal government to adopt it? What are the sort of obstacles you've faced?
Well, thank you, Jennifer. The simple answer, I guess, straight up as to why we haven't yet legislated is because the major parties love the loophole and use it when it's convenient at election time to mislead the public. For me, I came into politics in 2019. I was a barrister. It wasn't on my bingo card to be a politician, but I felt strongly about the issues. And I was quite shocked as, I think, a non-politician to realise that we had so little legislation and rules around political advertising. I set about presenting a private member's bill called Stop the Lies. The title says it all in terms of how political advertising should be held to the same standard that we expect in our commercial transactions in terms of misleading and deceptive advertising. A lot of the arguments put up against it were around freedom of speech and concerns around who can be the arbiter of truth by having that title. So in my my second term, I worked and changed it a little bit and introduced it as consumer protection, a voter protection bill. And it is very much based on consumer protections because, again, long-standing in our commercial environment, we have consumer law to protect us as when we buy a product or a service from misleading and deceptive advertising, right? We value our money and we don't want to be scammed. And so for me, it was that kind of question of why are we not valuing our voting rights the same way as we are valuing and protecting our consumer rights. So I called it voter protections, and it is based very much on legislation as was introduced that's been long-standing in South Australia, in the ACT, and it's great to hear that around the world we are grappling with this question, because the lack of truth in political advertising means we have an erosion of trust in the outcomes. And as we see, information is spread so proactively through social media channels and very targeted to very specific audiences, it's very dangerous. And we currently have no guardrails around AI and deep fakes when it comes to that kind of content. So urgently needed. We had pushed our current government in Australia to introducing a electoral communications bill amendment bill, and that was done late last year. And it would have been great if they had genuinely been committed to it. Unfortunately, the Labor government did a deal with our opposition party to try and restrict minor and independent candidates from challenging the duopoly here in Australia, and chose to shelve electoral communication reform in favour of donation reform that embedded advantage. So I have also worked and launched a voluntary ethical political advertising code, which is a code, as you can imagine, a commitment to accurate and not misleading or deceptive content, that it should be precise, substantiated in political advertising, and it should be credible. And there should be a disclosure if any kind of AI or deepfake is used. And obviously, my intent is not to use it. But I think we have to get proactive. In Australia, every poll and sort of survey indicates voters of all persuasions support truth in political advertising, voter protections, whatever we want to call it. They want the facts straight up so that then they can make an informed decision on how they want to vote. They don't want to be lied to by politicians, and I absolutely support that.
So that is the perfect moment to come to Adam Price in Wales. Adam, this is a measure that would apply to political regulation. What about the other statements that politicians and candidates make? What have you been doing in Wales, and how would it sit alongside political regulation of advertising?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Yes, I've been working for, as you said in your opening remarks, on this issue of political lying, of deliberate deception in politics for close on 20 years. And the focus for the legislation that we have introduced through an amendment to a bill last year, but more recently, as a result of that, we got, as you said, a government pledge to introduce legislation which focuses really on not on advertising per se, but this would be complementary to that because it focuses on any statement which purports to be a statement of fact, but which is deliberately misleading by existing members of the parliament or indeed candidates as well. So the Welsh government has made a commitment to introduce legislation which will create a process whereby any member or candidate for the parliament that is found guilty of deliberate deception through an independent judicial process will be automatically disqualified. So if they're an existing member, they'll get disqualified from the parliament, but also if they're a candidate as well, they'll be barred from standing for a certain period of time. Some of the key elements there, it has to be an independent process and an independent judicial process because We don't want one group of politicians really sitting in judgment on another group of politicians. That wouldn't be fair. So we believe that the courts well set up to deal with issues of truth or deception in other contexts, and so we have fraud, don't we, in the sort of financial or commercial context. There is well-established processes and rules and norms whereby there can be a proper independent process in order to decide whether somebody has deliberately set out to deceive. It's important to stress everyone makes mistakes. I've made hundreds of them. I'm sure, Ian, every politician is going to make mistakes, honest mistakes. We're not about dealing with that. It's about actually knowing something is false and setting out consciously, deliberately to present something that is a lie for political purposes. We've set out in the amendment that we got passed, and in all the discussions with the government, we believe it's important that people should have the opportunity, if they've got something wrong, quite simply to say, "Oh, right, somebody's presenting new facts, etc. That clearly was wrong. Therefore, I'm withdrawing this." So this isn't about catching people. Most people who make honest mistakes, etc. We're talking about the minority of deliberate liars that are setting out to misuse the political process, to deceive the public, and to deny the public what Thomas Jefferson back in the American Revolution said, that there's a basic right of a public in a democracy to have accurate information. Otherwise, democracy can't function. So the government today in Wales is announcing its programme for government. And, this legislation, I'm sure, will be part of that programme. It should be passed in the next 9 months. So, Wales will have I think one of the first attempts to regulate statement by individual candidates, which is a really useful, I think, complement to the wider reform of political advertising that Zali just introduced.
Thanks so much, Adam. And just a quick bit of housekeeping. We will save the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So please do put them in the Q&A function and we will get to you if we can. Roz, you're a newcomer to this political environment and you spent 11 years as a management consultant. How surprised have you been? And how do you think that those who want these regulations can get it higher up the political agenda so that they're actually introduced?
Oh, a couple of great questions. Yes, as you say, I'm a relative newcomer. I was a normal person for 55 years before going into politics, still less than 3 years ago when I decided to stand for Parliament. Between the management consulting and standing for Parliament, you mentioned earlier the ocean rowing, and that was very much as an environmental campaigner. I used those ocean rowing voyages to raise awareness of the environmental crisis. So that's what brought me into politics. And I would say, in my experience, and I do mostly mix with Lib Dem MPs, they're there to do their best. I see a genuine desire to serve their communities. I see some very capable people who could probably be earning a lot more money and getting an awful lot less stick for it in the private sector, but they've chosen to go into politics out of a desire to serve. Are lies told? Sometimes unintentionally, as Adam mentioned. It was refreshing this morning to hear Mark Carney's victory speech in Canada, where one of the 3 values that he pledged to espouse was humility, saying that he's sure that he will make mistakes and he will admit those. And I think that the media have a role to play there in not describing it as a screeching U-turn if an MP says, you know what, more information has emerged, Previously, my stance was based on this information. Now I have more facts at my disposal, and it makes sense for me to change my mind. So it's sort of a systemic approach. I want to also zoom out for a moment. I'm knocking on a lot of doors at the moment in the run-up to the county council elections. And I would say that our British democracy is in crisis. I don't think that I'm exaggerating there. Last year's turnout for the general election was the second lowest in nearly 100 years since universal suffrage, at below 60%. I'm hearing from a lot of people, I've always voted, but you're all the same. You're all in it for yourselves. I'm sure that anyone else on this call, either in the audience or on the panel, who's knocked on doors has heard some of these accusations levelled at politicians. How are we going to restore that faith? It was interesting to see in the chat, Laurie in particular has mentioned Taiwan and what the marvellous Audrey Tang has been doing there to make politics, democracy much more inclusive. Audrey Tang says it's not about whether people trust the government, it's about whether government trusts the people to have a say in the decisions that are going to affect their lives. So I think that is a way to come back to your question, Jennifer, to both restore faith in politics and to move it up the political agenda. To be honest, politics, like big corporations or many other kind of domains, it is a system. It is a very ancient, well, our UK democracy is a very old system that will protect itself. As a Lib Dem, we want to have proportional representation. We've already seen the difficulty of what is a relatively minor change to our constitutional way of doing things. So we face this ongoing problem that the party in power is not going to change the system that's put it in power. So I think what we're going to see going forwards is, in a way, we're going to be creating a new model that renders the existing one obsolete, that a lot more power is going to be devolved and claimed by communities. And this will force the government of the day to reevaluate how they continue to stay relevant as an authority. So I think that sort of pressure coming from the grassroots is going to be what really pushes this to front of mind for government. And to me, this feels existential, because if we don't have a system of governance that people trust, then we are in a right mess. So I think over the next few years, we're going to see a return, in a way, to more grassroots politics, where you actually get to look in the eyes of the person who is representing you and gauge for yourself whether or not they are trustworthy.
Thank you. Ian, just picking up on Roz's point there about trust in democracy, the nature of political campaigning has changed, as you chart in your book. Online campaigning has completely changed the environment. How can, in this new political landscape, how can we restore trust amongst voters?
I think that's a absolutely key point, Jennifer, that in the time since I've been in politics, and Adam and I came into politics together in Parliament in 2001, before Facebook existed. And the whole political process has gone through a complete revolution, which is unique in political history, whereby campaigning now, despite the door knocking that Roz is currently doing, is largely conducted online. And what's most extraordinary is that the politicians, with all due respect to the politicians here today, largely still fight elections as if it was 20 years ago, and don't recognize that the process of elections has completely changed. And I think the first vital step that needs to be done is that the politicians need to coin a phrase, take back control of the electoral process, because at the moment they are delegating a lot of the process to the tech companies who set the rules by which our democracies are function. The information that's communicated is largely communicated online, And those facts and the campaigning at the present time, certainly in the UK, is largely without financial limit. The content is uncontrolled, and there's no sanction for the type of misleading and lying to the general public that we see online the whole time. So it's vital that parliaments begin the process of taking back control. And this is where, as Adam outlined, what Wales is doing is so important, because rather than stepping back and leaving control to Elon Musk and to Mark Zuckerberg, who set the rules for their own companies, which operate worldwide, by the way, as we all know, parliaments need to control the method by which they're elected, and also oversee the information that the general public are presented with. So what we need to have is ensuring that all of the information that's presented to the general public is communicated to our electoral authorities, and that all candidates know what's being said about them by their opponents within elections, so that you have an open discussion on issues and relating to personalities, which the voters can see and make honest choices. A lot of the campaigning nowadays is communicated one-on-one from political parties to the individual voters, and very often other parties and competitive candidates don't see what's being said, so that misinformation can go out without any sanction at all. And what's most extraordinary is that the politicians whose jobs and livelihoods and whose ideals motivate them actually are allowing this to happen. And even where we have a Labour government at a UK level, which is not taking the action that I would like to see on this. In Australia, the position is the same as Zali has outlined. And it really is time for us to stop the system being controlled by tech multinationals, and for Democrats across the world to take back control of the process.
Zali, you've written a lot about the impact of false advertising on referenda, and of course in Australia you have just had a very significant referendum. How different The Voice, how different do you think it would have been, and what role did false political advertising have in that context?
Yes, I mean, the Voice referendum we had for recognition in our constitution of First Nations Australians was incredibly divisive, and as the campaign evolved, it got worse and worse. It was very much infiltrated by right-wing conservative groups from the US, very Trumpian style. They worked with an organisation called Advance Australia, who have been in the background of our politics in terms of really being as third-party disruptors, but fronts for conservative politics. And we saw very divisive rhetoric and multiple, very sophisticated, again, we're looking at audiences having, various accounts and fronts for whether the proposition went far enough or not far enough. It was divisive. So we're talking about very targeted advertising strategies and messaging strategies that really pinpoint the element of fear or concern that a particular demographical group has, and then target that group with very advertising. So we can have a broader discussion of truthfulness of politicians and of all communication. I think that sort of gets into a broader area, and I think then electorally we are accountable. If we're found to be liars as politicians, hopefully our communities don't re-elect us, right? And that becomes our accountability. But when we're looking at paid content that is purposefully pushed and targeted, that is where I guess I'm focusing my attention, because we know we have a lot of disengaged voters in all of our countries. In Australia, luckily, we have protections because we do have compulsory voting and preferential voting. And that means we have a very high turnout, and all votes count ultimately. But still, we are seeing that, huge portions of the population that are disengaged and disenfranchised from politics are prone to conspiracy theories and mis and disinformation. So obviously disinformation is when it is done by design and it was with purpose that they are fed false facts. At the moment, our only protection is to pre-bunk that the misinformation there is around issues that you can see coming up, and try and inoculate the public in understanding what, being educated to the issues. But we saw with the referendum, very hard to do within a small time frame, and especially on a question that impacted us all as a nation, but there wasn't enough truth telling and knowledge, I think, to pre-bunk the misinformation.
Thanks, Ali. And just picking up that point with you, Adam, obviously politicians can make statements, but how accountable are they in practice for the full statements they make? So the misstatement may be in an advert, but if that advert is then propagated by a politician, or if a statement that a politician makes is then used in an advert, there's a relationship between the two. And I'm thinking in particular what happened when you tried to hold former Prime Minister Tony Blair to account in the House of Commons for misleading Parliament. I don't know if you want to tell viewers what happened there.
Well, I got thrown out of the House of Commons actually for accusing the Prime Minister of being a liar, because we're not allowed to because there are no liars in the House of Commons, of course, according to the rules. I think in a sense, I mean, to Zali's point, well, to Ian's point rather, I think the difference, the distinction between political advertising and individual statements by politicians has kind of got less because of social media, in a sense, because individual statements can be carried directly through WhatsApp or whatever, micro targeting through social media, etc. I think if we look at why this whole conversation is important, and why I think coming up with innovative responses and solutions to the democratic crisis that Roz I think is absolutely right to point to. There are three things that have come together. One is the kind of technology that Ian talked about, which some of the propagandists of the 1930s could only have dreamt of, couldn't they? Secondly, you've got a group, as Zali pointed out, globally there are people out there, mostly on the populist right and worse, that are motivated to use these tools and use deception as part of their political armory. And the third element is you have a public which doesn't trust mainstream institutions, which is alienated from the political process, which feels that nobody's listening to them. And, the economy has been in crisis and in the doldrums for 15 years, and nobody is offering them, they believe, many of them believe anyway, the basic elements of a decent life. So you put those three things together and you've got a very, very toxic combination. And, we need to come up with solutions in all of those areas. We need to provide those decent elements of a decent life for people, but also we need to actually defend democracy, because everything that I've described, if you think about historical analogies are never absolute, but if you think about what led to the crisis of democracy in the 1920s and 30s, we're in a kind of same space, aren't we? And that's why actually coming up with creative ideas which defend democracy and absolutely re-engage with the public that have lost trust through the kind of methods, as we've heard, the democratic innovations that we've heard from Taiwan and other places. We need to do all of these things. There is no single method, no single idea that is going to take us in the very, very dark place that we are at the moment to where we need to be. And we need to try things out. Some of them will work better than others. But we need to have that sort of experimental approach, because if we don't find the solutions, what is already a very bad situation is going to become much worse, I believe.
Ian, coming back to your point about the need for governments to regulate the social media space properly, One of the things that Compassion in Politics would like to see is legislation to ensure that platforms are legally publishers, which would mean that they were then bound by the same restrictions as other media platforms. And when I've discussed that with government ministers, they've said we can't possibly do that because of Trump, because of intelligence sharing, because of all the things that, all the punishments that could come back. So in this Trumpian era, how easy will it be to wrest control back from the social media platforms into the hands of Democrats?
It will be very difficult. And the situation has actually got worse since when I was in Parliament 2018 to 2019. There was actually a general sense, even in the United States, that there needed to be more regulation of politics online because of the interference that happened in the 2016 presidential election from Russia, and there was a sense that we needed to start regulating online politics. Unfortunately, amazingly, we've gone backwards because we're now in a situation that you describe, where Trump is actually setting up the tech giants at the front of his inauguration and actually batting for them against truth being protected by democratically elected governments in the rest of the world, who are being threatened with trade sanctions if they interfere with globalized American power from the tech giants. So it's a really difficult situation, but we have had governments who, some in Australia, we've seen the Welsh government in the UK, at EU level, steps have been taken to protect our democracy through proper regulation. And the type of regulation I'm talking about is really regulation that always applied in politics offline before the tech platforms came along. So it's nothing excessive. It's something where really we want to see the same rules online as we see offline. So we need to have those introduced. And we are, and I emphasize this again, in a completely different political world. I mean, in the UK, for example, we never used to talk about advertising in politics because no one did it, because of the financial limits that were strictly applied before political advertising came along. We weren't allowed to have televised adverts. And now we have a situation where I could have a 12-hour film about me individually broadcast worldwide in the middle of an election campaign, without any sanctions. So we have a completely different world, which is being ignored by most politicians. And we need to get proper rules in place to protect our democracies. I really welcome the work that Adam's doing and that the Labour Welsh government is doing to start to undertake this. I want to see that happening at UK level as well, and to begin to exert pressure. And we also need to build allies with other groups who are affected by the online world to make sure that governments start taking responsibility.
Thanks so much, Ian. Roz, as an environmentalist, what is the impact when you're trying to deal with an existential crisis like climate change? What is the impact of all this disinformation in trying to achieve effective action? That's ultimately what democracy is about. It's about dealing with the crises that we face. So what is the impact, for example, on climate?
Yes, yeah. By definition, anything that comes onto a politician's desk is a really big, gnarly, knotty problem, because all the easy ones get dealt with elsewhere. I was actually at an event recently up in Yorkshire, and somebody in the audience stood up and said, when a politician's going to start telling the truth? And it was quite an interesting question in the context of an event I'd been to not very long before, that I'd gone to because it promised to be about food security, which is something that I care very much about, but turned out to be much more of a kind of alt-right conspiracy theory kind of event. And their truth is very different from the kind of truth that I think that this individual in Yorkshire was talking about. At the yes. There is a lot of misinformation around climate change, and especially how it's being co-opted to exert a surveillance, and how we're all going to be controlled and locked down into cities and all of this. And I think that the way that you just have to invite people to open their eyes, open their ears, and look at what's actually happening in the world. You don't need to be a climate scientist to see that our weather patterns are changing, that spring arrives earlier. Today it's forecast to be 25 degrees centigrade here in April, which is extraordinary. So people need to trust themselves and the evidence of their own senses more. And I think that if we, this critical thinking, this objectiveness, if we could bring that into the education system, I do get a little bit frustrated around education, not with teachers. Teachers do an amazing job, but the syllabus is not equipping our young people for the future that they're actually going to be facing. And one of the key skills that they really, really need is critical thinking, is how to identify truth in what is becoming this post-truth, very confusing landscape of facts and counterfacts and alternative truths. So to follow the money, to ask yourself who benefits from this particular narrative that I'm hearing, that I think is going to be one of those absolutely crucial meta skills that our young people really need to learn, so that they can discern for themselves fact from fiction, from deep faith, from post-truth, so that they're able to navigate this very complex landscape.
Thanks so much. And we're going to run until 5 to the top of the hour, as we've got so many excellent questions. I'm going to come to the questions in the chat now, and then we'll come back to each of the panelists for a closing thought. And Ian mentioned the measure that Adam's promoting, and I'm just going to put in the chat a petition which 200,000 people have already signed to bring that measure that's happening in Wales to Parliament. Now, I'm going to take two questions together from the chat about accountability. What sanctions, and anyone feel free to come in and answer this from the panel. Do we need a criminal sanction? Is a professional sanction enough? Adam, maybe that's one for you. And Zali, how would you make your proposal bite?
Well, Adam, you go for it if you want.
Yeah, sure. I think the best option would be a criminal offence. That was the original bill that we presented at Westminster, and the amendment that we got through. The advantage of that is, you know, it's a serious offence, and I think the criminal system is the best way, I think, to protect the interests of all, but also it's something that the public understand, and it gives it a status. You know, we make it a criminal offence for you to tell a lie to the public in the financial arena, you know, in fraud, etc. Why should we say that defrauding the public in a political sense is somehow less serious? So that would be the preference. And there are a few parliaments in the world in narrower circumstances that already make it a criminal offence to lie. Indeed, in Western Australia and in Queensland, it is an offence for an MP to lie to Parliament. And indeed, one MP in Western Australia went to jail for 3 years and was called the Pinocchio of Parliament by the judge in that case. So there are a few cases, and indeed, the former Chancellor of Austria was also found guilty recently of lying to Parliament, but only in that very specific, but the very narrow context of lying to Parliament. I would say, well, if you make it a criminal offence to lie to Parliament, why not make it a criminal offence to lie to the public as well?
Zali, how would your measure work?
Well, ours is pecuniary, not criminal. I think you have to walk before you can run. And rather than scaring everyone off with the legislation, is trying to get consensus and build that sort of collaborative approach. So we focused on a pecuniary penalty, obviously fines, which become more and more significant, in particular when it's corporations involved in the misleading and deceptive conduct. This is where I think it's the players that you bring to the table, I think is quite interesting. So our commercial advertising sector is a voluntary led. It has an ad standards board, which is led by professionals that rule over complaints and determine. And we have, of course, the ACMA, the Communication and Media Board that looks at things. But what I've been engaging with the ad sector because their reputation is on the line, and that's why their kind of voluntary codes have worked. And I think where we need to take political advertising is to that same space whereby, for example, if we had a system where political advertising must be pre-approved before it can be published, and if all publishers know their reputation or significant consequences come from publishing content that does not have a pre-approval, then you are stopping misinformation at the source before it is pumped out. So this is where you're paying to really target a particular audience. So that's where I'm looking and working with the commercial advertising sector around how do we replicate the model that's worked in the commercial sector to the political arena without infringing freedom of speech. Opinions can still be there, but as soon as we get into that paid content arena, we have some guardrails to ensure we are not paying to disseminate propaganda, essentially, that is based on disinformation.
And that's very similar to the model that Reform Political Advertising is pushing for in the UK. If I can throw a question at you, Ian and Roz, from the chat, how do we bring this legislation into the Overton window so that the major parties would actually be willing to adopt it? It exists, it has overwhelming public support, but how do we make it enough of a priority with so many competing issues for government attention right now, not least war in Europe?
Well, we've talked about the crisis in politics, and it's extraordinary that we have to try to persuade the elected representatives to take steps to address what is a crisis and widely perceived to be a crisis in politics. You know, we've seen the threats to democracy that we now face right across the world, and one issue that we haven't really touched on is the overseas interference in our politics, in our different political systems that we've seen in virtually every country, every liberal democracy that exists at the present time, and the way that that has been helped and facilitated by globalized tech platforms, and also the increased importance of money and the cost of political advertising in our politics. So the important thing is to engage with the politicians, first of all, to try and persuade them. I also mentioned working with other interest groups who are pressurizing. I'm thinking in particular of those who are working to protect young people from the tech platforms, working to introduce regulation of those platforms, because we're protecting society and wider society. And at the moment, parliaments just aren't stepping up to the plate to take on the tech platforms. And it's really important that we make clear that this is about Parliament protecting fundamentals in our society, such as democracy, such as protecting our young people, because the tech world and its huge impact on all of our lives at the moment is treated as uniquely as beyond regulation within our society. There's no other industry that is permitted to damage, for example, our children or our democracy in this way. So we need to stress the importance of that to the politicians, to the people who are actually charged electorally with dealing with these problems.
Roz, a couple of questions about how do we engage with voters? The response often is apathy or disgust, and even more importantly, how do we engage with young people to get them involved?
And maybe I can tie this back to the previous question that you addressed to Ian and me. It may be a little bit outside the Overton window at the moment. I'm a big fan of citizens' assemblies. It may be that things have to get a bit worse before they can get better, and before citizens' assemblies come within that Overton window. Maybe our voter turnout rate needs to dip below 50%, at which point you really have to ask whether it's actually a democratic system. Citizens' assemblies have been used quite successfully around these ethical questions. So I would like to see an assembly that represents a genuine cross-section of British society down to the age of, let's say, 16. If you're 16 years old, you're old enough to pay taxes, get married, join the military. You should have a say in our democracy, in my opinion. So a representative citizens' assembly to reconsider how we make government really work for the people. Again, it's that problem of how do you persuade the party in power that benefits from the existing power structures to embrace this. So it may, I hate to even say this, but what we see unfolding in America at the moment, I hope that the silver lining of that will be that the pendulum will swing back the other way, that governing by executive orders becomes impossible over there. So maybe we do need to dip even lower in our democracy in this country in order to shift that Overton window, to create the opportunity and the invitation for a genuinely representative assembly to consider these existential questions for our British democracy.
Thanks, Roz. And unfortunately, we have now run out of time for any more questions, but I would like to come to each panelist to give a closing statement under a minute, if you can, as we're running short of time. I'm going to keep with the same order because it helps my dinosaur brain. Zali.
Well, what a fantastic discussion. We have some protections in our electoral our electoral act, and there's a question in there around why hasn't that worked. Unfortunately, the interpretation from the court has been that it is you cannot mislead or deceive a voter in how to fill out a ballot paper, not as to the content of information. I think where there's really interesting and exciting development is a push for an online duty of care act in relation to conduct by the social media platforms and how they use algorithms. I think that will impact political discourse as well. But lastly, we've had in Australia a really interesting conversation around the use now of influencers, for example, in addition to legacy media, and any content that made in collaboration with influencers online, for example, now has to be authorised as a political communication. And so that is already bringing in this new sphere of communication for us as politicians. So I think the more we discuss it, the more there is the appetite from the public. The public is very engaged on this issue in Australia. They simply don't believe the advertising they see, which is at least one form of inoculation.
Adam.
Yeah, so I wanted to help and end on a hopeful note, and to point to the role historically of democratic innovators, and we've talked about South Australia and its truth in political advertising law, which has worked really well for many decades. South Australia, I think, was the first place to have the secret ballot in 1856, and that then became the global norm. So, innovators and pioneers, they have been the method by which democracy has improved itself, has kept up to speed with, social change and challenges, etc. So, the kind of conversation that we're having this morning is the kind of conversation that we need to have. And let's get out there, let's innovate, because yes, democracy in a crisis, but crisis brings forward creativity. Crisis leads, and problems lead to solutions. And I think it's great that we're creating a network. We're facing a global challenge, but a global network of creativity and innovation. That's how we can respond to the challenge and create a democracy that's going to deliver to people better than the one that we have at the moment.
Thank you. And we're running over time. So Roz and Ian, if I can ask you to keep your closing statement even briefer.
After you, Ian.
Well, I think it's been tremendous to have everybody together from right across the globe, because this is a massive globalized issue, as we've already discussed. I do think that the importance of governments taking initial action, but also absolutely engaging everyone, wider society, in recognizing the issue that we're facing. Seeing that we don't need to delegate it to those who are running the tech companies, that we have to engage better with our democracy and also educate our own politicians about what's actually happening. Because as a politician, I didn't really discover about this until the last couple of years of my time in Parliament. And I think a lot of our politicians don't really understand the situation. So go and see them wherever you are as a first step, to say to them how important this is. Because believe it or not, a lot of them will not understand the issues involved. And because they don't have time to, and I speak as a former MP myself. So engage and start to persuade the governments to take initial steps and work with citizens to deal with the issues.
Roz, final word to you.
I really want to thank you, Jennifer, for chairing this panel, and thanks to everybody who has tuned into this webinar today. Sharing the mood of optimism, I do think that positive change is coming. I think it's going to be a bumpy ride, but I'm really seeing more local communities claiming the power that they've got locally to make a difference. And maybe we'll start shifting to something more like the French model, where everybody knows the mayor of their local community, where you actually know the person who represents you. When we look at the Scandinavian countries and their strong social democracies, one of the reasons that that's attributed to is that because they have smaller populations, people have fewer degrees of separation away from their elected representatives. So I hope that over the coming years, we will see much more devolution to the community level, and that we will gradually, brick by brick, rebuild our trust in our systems of governance.
Wonderful closing. Thank you so much to all our panelists, to all who've attended. If you want to find out more about reform political advertising and compassion in politics, I've put the links in the chat. Compassion in Politics is about to launch in Australia, so we'd love to hear from anyone who wants to get involved. And thank you to everyone who is fighting on this important issue. There'll be more conversations like this.